What if a simple reflection of light, seen for less than a second in the rearview mirror, was actually a warning from heaven to save your life? Have you ever stopped to think how many times something seemingly small, almost insignificant, can carry an enormous purpose? Now imagine driving in the middle of the night, on an almost deserted road, silence all around, only the constant sound of tires hitting the asphalt, and suddenly, something unusual happens. A flash appears out of nowhere, a strange, quick, unexpected sign. Your heart races. Your mind tries to understand. Your instinct reacts. Would you brake? Or would you continue as if nothing had happened? Perhaps you've never experienced anything like this. Or perhaps you've felt that inexplicable shiver, that warning that comes without logical explanation. Have you ever been through this? That moment when everything seems normal until something changes in the air, in the heart, in perception. Stories of prophetic deliverance before destruction often begin exactly like this. In the ordinary, the simple, the everyday. A day like so many others. Any road. An ordinary driver. And yet, something extraordinary is about to happen. That night, darkness prevailed. The sky was overcast, starless. The road was long, silent, too empty for that hour. The driver was lost in thought, tired after a long day's work, his mind elsewhere, but his hands firmly on the wheel. Nothing seemed out of place. No strange noises. No suspicious movements. Just the feeling that everything was under control. Until, in an almost imperceptible instant, a bright signal appeared in the rearview mirror. It wasn't an ordinary headlight. It wasn't the reflection of another car. It didn't make sense. It was different, strong, direct, as if something wanted to grab his attention at any cost. That glare pierced more than the mirror. It pierced his thoughts, quickened his pulse, tightened his chest. A second of hesitation. A second that separates routine from tragedy, normality from destruction, life from death. How many times do we ignore signs like these? How many times do we keep speeding even when something inside us is telling us to stop? This kind of testimony of deliverance carries a silent question. What if this warning wasn't by chance? What if it was a divine warning? An invisible care, one that makes no sound, but changes everything? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may deeply surprise you. This isn't just another impressive story. It carries a message, a warning, a call to those who believe, and even to those who still doubt, that God still speaks, still protects, still sends signs before the fall, before the destruction, before the end. Perhaps you are watching this video now out of curiosity, perhaps out of faith, or perhaps because, deep down, you feel that something needs to be awakened within you. There are people who only realize their deliverance after the danger has passed. Others understand that that delay, that obstacle along the way, that restlessness without apparent reason was precisely the hand of God preventing something worse. In that split second, seeing the glint in the rearview mirror, the driver didn't think about religion. He didn't think about angels, or deliverance, or prophecy. He simply felt. He felt he needed to act. He felt he needed to brake. He felt something wasn't right, even without being able to explain why. And sometimes that's exactly how the signs arrive, without warning, without apparent logic, just with the urgency of someone who knows that time is too short for lengthy explanations. How many deliverances happen every day without anyone knowing? How many lives are saved by seconds, by centimeters, by decisions that seem impulsive, but that may carry a divine direction? What you will hear today is not just about a driver, a road, and a bright sign. It's about spiritual attention, about sensitivity, about obeying even when reason doesn't understand. And perhaps, as this story unfolds, something else will begin to stir within you. A memory, an experience, a warning that, until now, you've never been able to explain, but that changed the course of your life. Because sometimes, the sky speaks in silence, and only those who are attentive can hear. And it was precisely the moment the glint appeared in the rearview mirror that everything began to change. And as this story unfolds, perhaps something inside you is also stirring. Maybe an old memory, a scare that turned into deliverance, a strange feeling that made you change course, delay an appointment, call someone without knowing exactly why. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, or if you have experienced something similar. Your experience may be exactly the sign that someone else needed to hear today. And if this message is already speaking to your heart, liking this video is a simple but powerful way to help this content continue to reach more lives. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, with this type of warning, with this faith that does not fade. And if you feel you want to walk together, continue listening to testimonies like this, learning to discern the signs before the fall, subscribe to the channel. That way we stay connected, as a community that believes that God still speaks in unexpected ways. Because everything that happened on that road, on that silent night, in that decisive second before breaking, is yet to be revealed, and every detail completely changes how this story is understood. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because before the flash, before the breaking, before the deliverance, there was just an ordinary man living another ordinary day. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary in the eyes of those who passed him on the street. He woke up early, as on so many other days, with the alarm clock ringing at the same time as always, his body still heavy from a sleepless night, his mind already racing with responsibilities that don't wait. Work, bills, deadlines, small problems that accumulate and shape our mentality almost without us realizing it. He drank his coffee hurriedly. Perhaps he forgot something on the table. Perhaps he left home with that feeling that the day would be too long for the energy he had available. At work, more pressure, more fatigue, more automatic decisions made on autopilot. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't famous, he didn't have an inspiring story to tell until then. He was just someone trying to cope with his own journey, like so many of us. His head was full, his heart burdened with worries that no one sees from the outside. And when the day finally ended, when it was already night, his body was exhausted, his attention was no longer the same, and yet he got into the car to face the road, as he had done so many times before. That road was nothing new. He already knew every curve, every dark stretch, every point where the asphalt seemed to swallow the light of his headlights. Precisely for that reason, perhaps, the danger seemed less. Repetition creates this false sense of control, as if nothing could go off script. He kept driving while his mind wandered, revisiting conversations from the day, overdue bills, decisions that needed to be made, doubts about the future. The road seemed to mirror that inner state, long, silent, with dangerous stretches that appear when you least expect them. The atmosphere that night was heavy. The air seemed thicker, the sky overcast, without stars to serve as a reference. The road lighting failed in some places, creating those intervals of darkness that demand heightened attention, just when fatigue begins to take its toll. And he, like any human being, was susceptible to it. His eyelids felt a little heavier, his posture relaxed beyond what was ideal, his concentration was no longer at its peak. A single second of distraction on that kind of road can be enough to change everything. And that's where one of the hidden truths behind many testimonies of deliverance lies. These experiences almost never happen at the height of faith, strength, or vigilance. They usually occur when we are weak, on the edge, vulnerable. It's when we think we are alone in our own routine, facing life on autopilot. The impact of these moments comes precisely from there, because they shatter the illusion that everything depends solely on our control, our rational decisions, our human attention. While driving, he wasn't thinking about transformation, purpose, or spiritual revelations. He was simply trying to get home. Perhaps he was thinking about the hot shower he would take, the food he still needed to prepare, the rest that seemed as distant as it was necessary. The external journey and the internal journey intertwined on that road. Outside, curves, shadows, asphalt. Inside, doubts, fatigue, pressure, all moving together at the same pace. And it is precisely at this point that many things begin to take on a different meaning. Because, when we look back, we realize that deliverance doesn't begin at the moment of impact, but much earlier, behind the scenes of our own story. It begins in the details we ignore, in the small decisions, in the routines that seem insignificant. It begins on the road we choose, at the time we leave, in the emotional state with which we face the journey. All of this builds the scenario where something greater can happen. That driver could be anyone. Could be you coming home from work. Could be someone from your family. Could be someone you met on the street today. That's one of the reasons why this type of story resonates so deeply. It's not about someone too far removed from our reality. It's about someone who lives the same simple life, faces the same challenges, carries the same invisible burdens. The identification comes quickly, almost automatically. And perhaps that's why, when the sign appears, when something completely defies the logic of everyday life, the impact is even greater. Because it breaks with everything that seemed predictable, pierces the routine like a silent question. Is there something beyond what our eyes see? Is there a greater direction guiding even our most inattentive steps? That night, before anything extraordinary happened, there was only a tired man, a dangerous road, and a succession of simple decisions. Accelerate, stay on course, keep going. Nothing indicated that, in a few moments, that normal sequence of life would be interrupted by something that would completely change the way he saw his own story. Nothing showed that that ordinary journey was about to become a turning point, one of those that you only truly understand after everything has already happened. What's most striking is realizing how, often, the impact of such an experience isn't limited to the event itself, but spreads throughout a person's entire life. It changes their mindset, their perspective on decisions, their sensitivity to signals, and even how they face their own fears. Some begin to live with more awareness, some with more gratitude, some with more questions than answers. But almost no one remains exactly the same person after going through something like this. And while he drove, unaware of any of this, without imagining the revelations to come, the world continued seemingly as normal. The clock showed another ordinary time of night. The engine maintained the same continuous sound. The headlights cut through the darkness at the same pace as always. Everything seemed the same, until it wasn't. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the moment that sign appeared wasn't just a visual event, it was a rupture in the logic of the reality he had known until then. Amidst the constant flow of the road, the regular sound of the engine, and the weariness that insisted on weighing on his eyes, something broke through the scene like a burst of light. It wasn't gradual. It didn't give warning. It simply appeared. A strong, direct glare, impossible to ignore, reflected in the rearview mirror as if someone had lit a flame in the middle of the darkness. For a fraction of a second, his mind tried to react rationally. Is that a car behind us? Is that a distant headlight? Is it just a reflection? But none of those answers held up. There was no other vehicle. There was no curve that justified it. There was no logic to explain it. And it is precisely at this point that the strangeness lies, when reason fails but the body understands first. His heart raced in a way he couldn't explain. A chill ran down his spine, not like ordinary fear, but like a deep, almost physical warning, as if something inside him was screaming without words. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His foot hesitated for a microsecond on the accelerator. Time seemed to slow down strangely, as if that second had stretched longer than it should have. In that interval there was no prayer, no elaborate thought, no plan. There was only a decision born from the purest impulse, to brake. Not because he knew what was happening, but because he felt he needed to do it. A decision that didn't follow logic, but rather sensitivity. The sound of the brakes echoed on the empty road. The body was thrown slightly forward. The impact of the deceleration brought with it a surge of adrenaline. The heart pounded in the chest, as if trying to escape through the mouth. Breathing became short, rapid, and uneven. All this while the flash still seemed etched in the mind, like an image that doesn't easily fade. It wasn't an ordinary flash. It wasn't something mechanical. It had intensity, presence, and weight. And perhaps this is where the idea of warnings before destruction becomes more real than ever. Because it wasn't a calming warning. It wasn't something gentle. It was urgent. It was invasive. It was as if the moment demanded an immediate response, with no room for doubt, no time to question. These are the decisions that shape entire destinies, those that are born before explanation, in the invisible backstage of our consciousness. After braking, the silence grew even heavier. The car was now almost stopped in the middle of the road. He looked in the rearview mirror again. The light was gone. Darkness had regained control of the scene. The world seemed normal again, too normal. But inside, nothing was normal. The impact wasn't just physical, it was internal. Something had been triggered. A shapeless question began to pulse within him. What was that? It's curious how, in those moments, we quickly try to fit the inexplicable into some acceptable explanation so as not to confront the mystery. Maybe it was tiredness. Maybe it was an illusion. Maybe I'm exaggerating. The human mind seeks security even when the truth seems to point to something bigger. But, at the same time, there's a part of us that recognizes when something is completely out of the ordinary. And he recognized it. Even without understanding, he knew that it wasn't just his imagination. His body still trembled slightly. His hands were sweaty. His stomach felt like it was churning. Fear hadn't yet transformed into understanding, but it had already transformed into attentiveness. The kind of attentiveness that changes the way you look at the road, at time, at your own thoughts. He stood still for a few seconds, breathing deeply, trying to regain control of the situation, trying to understand why he had reacted that way. And, in that silent darkness, that impulsive choice began to become the central piece of a turning point he hadn't even imagined yet. There is something powerful in decisions born from instinct when that instinct seems aligned with something beyond ourselves. It's not planned courage. It's not strategy. It's a response. And responses like that often precede revelations that only become clear later. Transformation rarely begins with explanations. It begins with ruptures. From the outside, it looked like just a man hitting the brakes. Inside, it was a collision of sensations, emotions, and perceptions that dismantled the automatic routine he was immersed in. The road, which before seemed like just a path between 2 points in the day, now became the stage for something much bigger. Something that would change how he viewed his decisions from then on. Time continued to pass, but there was a feeling that something was suspended, as if that night had entered a different mode. He started moving the car slowly again, his heart still racing, his eyes more alert than ever, as if everything around him could reveal another surprise at any moment. Every meter traveled now carried an invisible tension. It wasn't panic. It was heightened awareness. It was the perception that there was more happening than his eyes could capture. And perhaps this is one of the most disconcerting hidden truths of this type of experience. The sign doesn't just come to prevent destruction, but to break with a way of living. It marks a before and an after that we don't always perceive at the time. Sometimes we only understand the real impact when we look back and realize that that night redefined our journey, our sensitivity, our way of interpreting the world. As he drove slowly down the road, still unaware of what had been avoided, unable to imagine the magnitude of his deliverance, something was already beginning to rearrange itself within him. Questions arose. Intuitions emerged. A different kind of unease settled in. He still didn't have the answers, but he was no longer the same man who, minutes before, had been driving on autopilot. And it is precisely at this point that everything begins to fall into place. Because there is a specific moment when reason finally encounters what instinct had already perceived. And when that happens, the story gains a depth that no one can ignore. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was only after that impulsive braking, that second when everything seemed to go off the rails, that the truth began to reveal itself in a way that was as brutal as it was silent. The car had barely come to a complete stop when he felt a strange shift in the air, as if the road itself had changed its breathing. The silence that followed the screech of the brakes wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, laden with something that was yet to happen. He kept his foot firmly on the brake, his body leaning slightly forward, his eyes alert, trying to decipher what the darkness concealed just ahead. And then, a few meters ahead, reality opened up before him without any gentleness. Out of nowhere, emerging from the sharp curve he knew so well, a truck appeared across the road. Too big, too fast, too heavy. The lights surged forward, tearing through the night like blades of fire, reflecting on the damp asphalt, illuminating for seconds a scene that could never be faced at high speed. The impact was only avoided because he was practically stopped. If he had moved forward a few more meters, if he had ignored that inexplicable sign, if he had continued on autopilot for just 3 or 4 more seconds, the encounter would have been inevitable. A head-on collision, a mass of iron against a light car. There would have been no possible avoidance. There would have been no reaction time. There would have been no story to tell afterward. The truck passed just meters from his car, making the ground vibrate, the air tremble, his chest tighten even more. The wind displaced by the force of the vehicle shook the parked car, as if the road itself wanted to remind him of how close everything had been to ending there. When the truck finally disappeared into the darkness, the silence returned in an almost frightening way. Now a heavy silence of revelation. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but awareness. He remained motionless for long seconds, trying to process what had just happened. His body was now truly trembling. His hands were sweating profusely. His heart seemed unable to resume a normal rhythm. And his mind, previously scattered with common worries, was now completely consumed by a single image. If I hadn't stopped, I would be dead. It is at this point that the notion of liberation ceases to be merely a beautiful concept and becomes a concrete, almost physical experience. The transformation occurs when the mind realizes that the line between routine and the end is absurdly thin, that the hidden truth behind many ordinary days is that they are all sustained by invisible details, that often it is not our skill nor our attention, nor our experience that keeps us alive, but decisions that arise from a place we do not fully control. He turned off the car for a few moments, needing to catch his breath, as if he had just driven through an invisible storm. His head rested on the steering wheel, his eyes closed for a few seconds, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions that overwhelmed his body. The impact wasn't just from the shock, it was from the understanding. It was from the realization that something bigger had directly interfered with his journey. That truck wasn't part of the day's plans. That fatal curve wasn't in the calculations of his tired mind. That collision in human logic would be just another accident in a cold statistic. But for him, at that moment, it became impossible to see it as mere coincidence. The sequence of events was too precise. The signal, the braking, the curve, the truck. Everything happened in such an exact chain that it dismantled any attempt to reduce it to simple chance. That man's journey was no longer divided solely between work and home. Now there was a milestone in the middle of the path, an invisible point in time where everything could have ended, but didn't. This type of experience affects one's mindset in a silent and permanent way. It's not a noisy change. It's something that begins from within, in the questions that start to arise, in the decisions that are made more consciously, in the way the future is viewed. He started the car again, his legs still trembling, his throat dry, his breathing too deep for a road that now seemed calm once more. But nothing was the same anymore. The same road, the same curves, the same asphalt, everything was still there. What had changed was him, his perception, the weight that night now carried, the awareness that his story had come dangerously close to being interrupted. And perhaps that's the most emotionally impactful point of this type of testimony. It's not just the image of what almost happened. It's the direct confrontation with the fragility of existence itself. It's realizing that life isn't guaranteed by contracts, plans, or routines. It's sustained by decisions that happen in fractions of a second, by signals that can be ignored or obeyed, by impulses that completely change the course of everything. As he resumed his journey, now much more slowly, his mind was no longer in the distant future, nor preoccupied with the day's problems. It was completely in the present. Each meter traveled carried the awareness that it had been an unexpected gift, an extra space in the journey itself, a chapter that wasn't guaranteed, but was granted. The impact of that revelation also brought a new unease. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a kind of question that doesn't leave you in peace so easily. Why me? Why at that exact moment? What was happening behind the scenes that night that my eyes didn't see? The road, which before was just a physical path, now seemed to carry invisible layers of meaning. And when the mind begins to grapple with these questions, something shifts in the very axis of life. The way of dealing with challenges begins to take on a different texture. Decisions cease to be merely quick reactions to fatigue and begin to carry a different weight. The hidden truth behind deliverance is not only that death was avoided, but that a silent calling was also made. He continued driving, still shaken, still on edge, still trying to process everything inside. The night remained dark, the road remained dangerous, but now a new layer of awareness accompanied every movement. It was no longer just about getting home. It was about understanding what that experience had just planted within him. And it is precisely here that the story gains even greater depth, because after the danger passes, after life goes on, something begins to stir within the person who experienced it. A transformation that is not always immediate, but that deepens little by little, like a silent current pulling the journey towards a new meaning. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. because after the danger is revealed, after the mind understands what almost happened, another layer begins to form, silent, invisible but powerful. It is the layer of spiritual interpretation. It's no longer just about a truck on a curve, about braking at the right time, about an impulsive decision that saved a life. It begins to be about meaning, about purpose, about that which cannot be measured by logic, speed, or distance. The question that begins to echo within him is no longer, how did this happen? But, why did this happen? And this question carries a different weight because it touches directly on faith, on mindset, on how the person perceives their own journey. For many people, experiences like this are not just well-resolved coincidences, but signs, warnings, interventions. For many, this is a prophetic deliverance, one of those warnings that arrive before the fall, when there is still time to change course. Until that day, he may never have stopped to think seriously about it. Perhaps he believed that everything was the result of human choices, quick reflexes, luck, or misfortune. But when reality imposes itself so precisely, so surgically, the mind begins to open up to other possibilities. The hidden truth behind such experiences is that they shatter old certainties and force an internal update, a profound revision of one's own way of seeing life. Does God still send signs? This question began to accompany him from that night on, not as an empty doubt, but as a living unease. Because if that gleam in the rearview mirror hadn't appeared, the end of that road would have been different. And this raises something that goes beyond fright. It raises the idea that there is a care that never sleeps, a vigilance that is not limited to our senses, a presence that acts even when we are not aware of it. But here's something important that isn't always clearly stated. Signs exist, but not everyone notices them. They don't always arrive spectacularly. Sometimes they come as a discomfort in the chest, a nameless restlessness, a strange feeling that makes us postpone an appointment, change course, or remain silent during an argument that could get out of control. And to recognize these signs, it's not enough to simply exist. Sensitivity is needed. Attention is needed. An inner disposition is required to listen to what makes no sound. This spiritual sensitivity doesn't spring from nothing. It's built into how a person lives, thinks, decides, and reacts. It's shaped behind the scenes of daily choices, in how one treats time, in how one treats one's own conscience. There are people who see clear signs and still ignore them. Others perceive them even before understanding. The difference, often, isn't in the sign itself, but in the inner state of the one who receives it. In his case, there was no rationalization at the time. There was obedience to impulse, an obedience that didn't know exactly what it was for, but which was enough to prevent destruction. And this reveals something disconcerting. Sometimes, obedience comes before understanding. Faith in those moments is not a pretty declaration. It's a movement, a step without a map, a response without a complete explanation. After that night, the road was never just a road again. Every trip carried an echo of that experience. Every decision was filtered through a silent question. Am I paying attention to the signs? Am I sensitive enough to notice when something is trying to warn me? The mindset transforms in this way, from the inside out, not by imposition but by impact. This type of experience also changes how a person views their own fragility. It's no longer a distant concept. It becomes tangible, breathable. The understanding that life isn't guaranteed until the end of the day, that there are forces completely beyond our control, brings with it a mixture of humility, awe, and gratitude. It's not paralyzing fear. It's living awareness. And when spirituality enters this process, everything takes on a new dimension. Chance ceases to be merely chance. Delay ceases to be merely delay. Deviation ceases to be merely error. Everything begins to be analyzed from another perspective. The impact of this on the personal journey is profound. Priorities change. Values are rearranged. Decisions begin to carry more weight, more intention, more presence. But there's also another side to this interpretation, a side that isn't always comfortable. Because if there are signs, then there's also a responsibility to listen. If there's a warning, then there's a choice. And choosing to listen isn't always easy. Sometimes it means slowing down when everything inside you wants to speed up. It means saying no when the whole scenario seems to demand a yes. It means stopping even when the whole world keeps moving. In this context, Faith ceases to be merely belief and becomes an attitude. It becomes obedience amidst uncertainty. It becomes trusting even when the explanation has not yet arrived. And this profoundly changes the way a person moves through their own journey. They begin to walk with more attention to detail, more respect for their own hunches, and more openness to that which cannot be measured by logic. What happened on that road wasn't just the interruption of an accident. It was the activation of a new way of looking at life, a different lens, a more sensitive filter. He began to realize that many past situations, which before seemed like mere strange coincidences, perhaps also carried signs that only now were beginning to make sense. Small, forgotten deliverances, closed doors that, at the time, hurt but were now seen as protection. This is one of the most profound revelations of this type of experience. Understanding almost always comes later. First comes the impact, then comes the confusion, then comes the question, and only then, little by little, does comprehension begin to form. Not as a ready-made answer but as a process, a silent transformation that reshapes the way we exist. He didn't leave that night with all the answers, but he left with something even more valuable. He left with an expanded awareness. He left with a different kind of focus. He left with the clear feeling that his story had been touched by something that didn't fit solely within the laws of nature. And that, in itself, was already a calling. What's most intriguing is that, for many people, the deliverance doesn't end the moment tragedy is averted. It continues to reveal itself in the following days, in subtle changes in behavior, in how the person begins to face their relationships, their conflicts, their fears. Physical deliverance paves the way for an internal process that can last a lifetime. And perhaps that's exactly what makes these testimonies resonate so deeply with so many people. Because deep down, we all know that we've been dangerously close to something that could have robbed us of our story. Not always on the road. Sometimes in emotional decisions, in toxic relationships, in impulsive choices, on paths that promised much but hid abysses. And yet, something made us stop. This realization shakes the foundation of our mindset. It reorganizes priorities. It invites us to look inward with more honesty. The hidden truth that emerges from these experiences is that living mindfully is often the difference between repeating destructive patterns and beginning a journey of transformation. While he continued trying to process all of this, still without definitive answers, something kept stirring within him. A restlessness mixed with gratitude, a fear mixed with curiosity, a silent desire to understand more, to go beyond the surface of that event. And this inner movement was far from over, because what had been saved that night was not just a body, but an entire story that still had much to reveal. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because at its core, the story was never just about that man, that road, or that truck on the bend. It's about something that permeates the experience of many people, perhaps even yours. It's about those moments when life seems to pull an invisible brake, when everything inside us was ready to keep accelerating. Moments when a nameless discomfort arises, an unease we can't explain, a change of course that, at the time, seems like a delay, frustration, a waste of time, but which later reveals itself as protection. How many times have you experienced something like this? A last-minute canceled appointment, a bus missed by seconds, a conversation interrupted at the exact moment, a decision you almost made but ended up postponing without knowing why. In the moment, the mind complains. The mindset accustomed to control gets irritated. We question, become impatient, sometimes even revolt. But, with time, when the behind-the-scenes events begin to reveal themselves, we realize that perhaps that delay was saving us from something we didn't even see. These are the small, significant turning points in the journey. They don't come with labels. They don't come with clear explanations. They just happen. And that's where the most delicate part lies. Recognizing the signal requires a sensitivity that isn't always active when we're immersed in the pressures of daily life. Routine overwhelms inner listening. Decisions pile up rapidly. Emotions become mixed. And, when we realize it, we're already living on autopilot, guided more by commitments than by awareness. The problem isn't living on autopilot per se. The problem is forgetting that, amidst this flow, there are subtle calls trying to reposition us. An invisible brake doesn't arrive making noise. It manifests as a strange sensation, an unexpected doubt, a slight discomfort that we insist on ignoring because we don't want to stop. Stopping takes work. Stopping demands confrontation. Stopping forces us to look inward, and we're not always ready for that. But it is precisely at this point that the transformation begins. Not as a grandiose act, but as listening. An inner willingness to perceive that not everything needs to be resolved by force, haste, or insistence. Sometimes the greatest change lies not in moving forward, but in holding back. Not in deciding faster, but in waiting. Not in accelerating, but in slowing down. When we look at stories like that of this driver, the tendency is to think about the physical escape, the accident avoided, the tragedy that didn't happen. But the deeper application lies in what this awakens in us on an internal level. Because it's not just cars that enter dangerous routes. We do too. We enter into relationships that hurt us, into choices that distance us from who we are, into journeys that promise much but demand too much. And often signs also appear there. A persistent discomfort, a repeated warning, a silent "don't go" that we insist on silencing. The hidden truth is that not all deliverance is immediate or visible. Some happen within the mind, when we give up on a decision that seemed certain. Others happen in the heart, when we back down from a word that could destroy a relationship. Others happen in the soul, when we abandon a path that was leading us to a place of exhaustion and emptiness. And, most of the time, only later do we understand the real impact of what was avoided. There's also a curious pattern in these warnings. They almost always appear when we're at our limit, too tired to think straight, emotionally overwhelmed, pressured by expectations, bills, deadlines, demands. It's at these times that our guard is down. And it's at these times, perhaps, that we need to be cared for the most. The human journey is made of strength, but also of exhaustion. Of lucidity, but also of confusion. Of faith, but also of fear. And it is through this tangle of emotions that the signal needs to pass. Not as theory, but as experience. Not as a pretty speech, but as a concrete decision. A break in the middle of the curve. A stop in the middle of the rush. A silence in the middle of the noise. It's not comfortable. It's not convenient. But often that's exactly what prevents destruction. Bringing this story into your own life inevitably means confronting your own decisions head-on. It's reliving that day when you almost said yes, but ended up saying no. That time you changed your mind at the last minute. That delay that almost made you lose your patience, but which you later understood. Or maybe you still haven't understood. Maybe you're still in the middle of the curve, not knowing exactly what you were spared. And that's okay. Not every blessing in disguise reveals itself immediately. The impact of these experiences lies not only in what was avoided, but in what is built afterward. They reshape our mindset. They make us more attentive to our own feelings, more careful with impulsive decisions, and more sensitive to our own limits. They teach us that not all pressure needs to be heeded, that not every opportunity needs to be accepted, and that not every open door is a green light to move forward. And perhaps the most profound reflection of all this is realizing that there is a fine line between insisting and trusting, between forcing and obeying, between controlling and letting yourself be guided. Paying attention to the signs doesn't mean living in fear, nor waiting for a light in the rearview mirror for every step of life. It means living with presence, with listening, with a heart less hardened by haste and more open to perception. This man's story brings this question straight back to us. Have we stopped when we need to stop? Have we listened when something inside us whispers to change course? Or have we been speeding along just to avoid appearing weak, indecisive, or insecure? Destruction often doesn't come from a sudden explosion, but from a series of small decisions that have been pushed aside without pause. There is also an aspect that almost always goes unnoticed. After deliverance comes responsibility. Not as a burden, but as awareness. The awareness that life goes on, but not in the same way. The awareness that something was preserved for a reason. The awareness that the journey continues, but now with a silent invitation to transformation. And this invitation does not demand perfection. It only demands attention. Perhaps you are in exactly that place right now, without a major tragedy explicitly averted, but with small interventions happening in your daily life. A no that keeps coming back, project that stalled, a relationship that hasn't progressed, a door that hasn't opened, and all of this still seems like just frustration. But who knows, maybe in the future, these pieces will fit together in a way that you can only imagine today. The truth is that paying attention to the signs before destruction happens isn't about living in anticipation of misfortune. It's about living with greater awareness of one's own path. It's about honoring limits. It's about respecting anxieties. It's about understanding that not everything that seems like a setback is a loss, and not everything that seems like an acceleration is a gain. And as these reflections take shape, as this story intertwines with your own, something even deeper begins to emerge, because, at some point, this experience ceases to be merely a narrative and becomes a mirror. Comment below, "This makes sense to me," and if this story has reached you, somehow, it's because it also found a place within you. So, if it makes sense for your heart to continue walking with me through this kind of reflection, subscribe to the channel, not as an obligation but as someone who chooses to. Remain close to conversations that awaken, that touch, that help you see life with different eyes. And if you want to leave a sign that you've been with me this far, write in the comments, "This message was for me." I'll know you've made it to the end of this journey with me. If you feel this connection is worth a simple gesture, leave a like. It's like a silent, "I understand" between us. And look, there's a video here that complements this topic in a special way. Click and continue with